Welcome to the Disabuse Podcast, where we seek to prevent, detect, investigate, and eliminate abuse in churches and faith-based organizations. Today, we're joined by Dr. Melodie Bissell. Melodie has a doctorate from the University of Toronto with a focus on nurturing the spiritual healing of victim survivors of abuse. Melodie is also president and CEO of Plan to Protect. For more than 25 years, Plan to Protect has provided the highest standard of abuse prevention and protection for organizations serving the vulnerable, including churches. Melodie, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Randall. It's great to be with you. Like-minded person.
Indeed. When I was growing up, we didn't wear bicycle helmets in the 70s and early 80s when we went and rode a bike. We didn't wear seatbelts when we got in the car. I still remember when there was a shift to beginning to wear seatbelts. There was gradually, through the 80s, 90s, and onwards, a growing awareness of the dangers of abuse, risk, harm, and we began to take measures in order to bring about greater safety within the environments of children. And I think that there's been a similar transformation in churches and faith-based organizations, a greater awareness of risk, the dangers of abuse, and how to bring about safety. And I think Plan to Protect has been a huge part of that. So I was wondering if you could just at the outset introduce us to Plan to Protect, say a little bit about how Plan to Protect came to be and what the vision and mission of the organization is.
Thanks so much, Randall, and I apologize for this cough. It's just come upon me, so I apologize for that. Plan to Protect, we're a boutique consulting company specializing in abuse prevention and response. We unapologetically provide the highest standard of abuse prevention and safeguarding for churches, charities, and not-for-profits that serve the vulnerable sector. Most of our clients are churches and faith-based clients, but we've since expanded as everyone needs abuse prevention if they're serving the vulnerable sector.
Now, how did Plan to Protect come to be, and how did you recognize that there was a need for this kind of service?
Plan to Protect, the manual, was first written in 1996, so almost 30 years ago now. And it was written under the umbrella of the Christian and Missionary Alliance in Canada. And the first version of the manual was written for children's ministry. And it really became recognized as one of the best resources in Canada for safeguarding. And so other denominations, other than the Christian Missionary Alliance, also picked it up. And now we have 17 denominations that recommend it to their churches and organizations, and we have probably about 40 to 45% of the church market in Canada using Plan to Protect as their resource of choice for safeguarding. In 2000, we added a youth module to Plan to Protect, and then in 2006 is when we incorporated the company. So we've actually been in operation as a company for going into our 19th year, but the manual is almost 30 years old. Yeah, many versions of it though.
I remember probably 20 years ago dropping our daughter off at a Sunday school in a church in the United States when we were visiting family, and we didn't know any of the people there. You just think back, you place incredible amount of trust in people when you hand over your child. And the thing is, after the service, we went to pick up our daughter, who was probably 2 or 3 years old at the time, and they didn't know where she was.
Uh-huh.
They couldn't find her, and it took about 20 minutes of deacons fanning out in the church to find that she had just wandered off with some other older kids and was off playing somewhere. No oversight. It just chills me to this day. So this whole idea of safeguarding, it was never too soon to have this become a foundational aspect of church life. What was the situation back in the 1990s when, before the manual was written, and then how have you seen things change and evolve over churches in the time that you've been working?
It was in the early 1990s that some of the mainline churches started writing protocols around abuse prevention. I often hear people say, and you referenced it just there, Randall, it's too bad we never had to do this in the old days. I heard that so many times, but we should have done it in the old days. Children were being abused, and Canada is still facing, and United States are still facing lawsuits of abuse that happened in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. People were aware of abuse and they were aware of child abuse, but the protocols didn't really start to surface until the late 1980s, 1990s. And they were often written by individuals that had been abused as children, and they wanted to prevent abuse from happening. They didn't want the same thing to happen to someone else as what happened to them. It was in 1996 that the Insurance Standard Bureau of Canada made a recommendation that all insurance companies in Canada add an exclusion clause to their insurance policies that said that sexual molestation and abuse were an exclusion to the policy. So if abuse happened, it wouldn't be covered by insurance. So at that same time as when Plan to Protect the Manual was first written, some of the same elements were there in the 90s as are today around screening of volunteers and staff members and the call for training of volunteers and staff members and recommending that individuals not be left alone with children or youth. So that's pretty common. That hasn't changed a lot. But when the insurance companies in Canada started informing their clients that they were not going to be covered for abuse coverage is when the demand for stronger standards and resources became more known. And that's when we approached the insurance companies and said that we were considering a one-stop consulting and training organization for abuse prevention. And the insurance companies were saying, well, you do that, you'll be our next best friend. And that's when we really started looking at mirroring the recommendations to what the insurance companies were requiring. We always wish that people would protect children and churches would protect children and young people and vulnerable adults because they really see this as part of their mission of their church. Unfortunately, it's been driven by the insurance companies, but I'm very grateful for the insurance companies for putting that pressure in place for us to really adhere to a high standard of protection.
Yeah, I think there's a cup is half full, cup is half empty there. The cup is half empty as you'd wish the church in many respects would have been more proactive without having to have the stick rather than the carrot from the insurance companies. But either way, if children receive greater protection and safety, all the better. Now, you've talked about, you alluded to the sense that there's been an expansion of the vision beyond children to youth, other vulnerable sectors. Tell me how that expanding vision of Plan to Protect and what it means to safeguard all vulnerable members of the community, how that has evolved and developed over time.
As an organization, anything that the insurance company is requiring, we can come alongside and help our clients accomplish that. And instead of everyone having to recreate the wheel, we have those templates and best practices, policies, statements, procedure statements. We've got the training material, all that covered with Plan to Protect, but it was probably about in 2011, 2012, the insurance companies approached us and said, we don't just want to protect children and youth, we want to protect vulnerable adults too. And we started recognizing and identifying that those would be the elderly when pastors go and do hospital visits and visit shut-ins. And then it was about in 2012, 2013, that all the refugees were coming into Canada. And we saw that refugees also are vulnerable people because language and because it's a new country and culture shock and things like that. And we were having churches that were sponsoring refugee settlement. So we really needed to put protocols in place for refugees. And so we looked at the elderly, individuals with disabilities, refugees, and it was in about 2018, 2019 that we saw that we really wanted to rewrite the manual So we had already had 3 versions of the manual, and we had been keeping it pretty much up to date, and we were adding things as we needed them. But we really wanted to rework the whole manual so it wouldn't just be focused on children and youth, but that it would be for the whole church to adopt a safe environment, whoever they were serving. Literally, I can tell you, we were doing the layout and design and the writing of the new manual, which was later published in 2022. And that was right about the time we were hearing about what happened at Willow Creek with Bill Hybels, and what happened with Ravi Zacharias, and what was happening in Canada with Brexy Cavey in the meeting house. And literally we were saying, stop the press. We have to strengthen our content on power differentials. We need to add more content around clergy sexual misconduct and abuse. And we need to strengthen the content in the manual around documentation. And what about spiritual abuse? Because that's so prevalent in churches, spiritual abuse. So we were literally stopping the press and adding more content to strengthen that material in the manual, which we are so pleased now is all part of our 2022 version of the church manual.
Can you say a little bit more about spiritual abuse? So you said there's this growing awareness of that as a distinct category of abuse and risk within faith-based organizations and churches. So what is spiritual abuse, and how are some of the ways that it can manifest?
It really is using scripture language or religious language to manipulate people for your own benefit or for the benefit of the church. I'm working with a church right now where there certainly seems to be abuse in power. There is a board chair, and who is both the board of deacons and the board of trustees, and he is in the pulpit many Sundays, and part of his work life is investments, right? So he's using that platform of being in the pulpit to make decisions that would benefit both his own personal business of investments and insurance and financial investments, both to benefit him personally or to benefit the church. And he has some of those characteristics of a narcissistic leader, and people don't feel safe bringing their concerns to him. He shuts people down when they do raise concern. And you can just see the impact this is having on the congregation, that many individuals have left the congregation because of this one leader, and no one seems to be able to stand up against him. So that would be one example of spiritual abuse. So it's something that we have to hold each other accountable to. And one of the things I often remind churches is that if you are a board member, you speak as a board, and the board has to hold people accountable for their actions and be willing to say the difficult things to people to hold people in check. And there certainly is a conflict if someone is both the chairman of the deacons and chairman of the trustee and making a lot of those financial decisions on behalf of the church. Often when you see spiritual abuse, you'll also see other forms of abuse, whether that be emotional abuse or financial abuse. You'll see those going hand in hand.
Is spiritual abuse a category that one finds reflected in policy documents in the same way that one might find a definition of harassment or bullying in a policy document, or is it just more in the background and we have to be aware of it?
We certainly need to teach people about it. And one of the insurance standards is defining abuse. So not just a major category of abuse, but even the different types of abuse. So churches should clearly define what is spiritual abuse, what is sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. So defining it in your safeguarding training how to recognize it, But I think when it comes to both spiritual abuse and sexual abuse, and I'm sure you'd probably agree with me, Randall, that we need strong whistleblower policies in place. We need a safe environment for people to raise concerns. And when a disclosure or an allegation of abuse arises, then churches really need to be able to identify, is this something that we need to investigate? And if there is an allegation that comes in under either a whistleblower policy or your reporting policies, then we would always recommend that there be a external investigation, because it's too hard to not bring your biases into play when you're doing an investigation.
Yeah, I will certainly agree with you heartily on that point. I want to talk to you about a little bit about your own doctoral research. So again, this was on nurturing spiritual healing of victim survivors of abuse. So big picture, what brought you to that work, and what were some of the key insights that you gained from doing that research?
I am a strong person of faith, Randall. I came to know Jesus Christ when I was a child, and I have dedicated most of my life to ministry. My husband is a pastor. We were missionaries on the mission field. Our children are missionaries. I grew up in the church. And earlier in my career, I was a child evangelist and a children's pastor. And I ended up as the provincial director in Ontario with Child Evangelism Fellowship. It was during that time that the insurance companies asked me what we were doing to protect children under our watch with CEF. And I didn't see anything in place to help us put those protocols and training in place. And so I ended up resigning from Plan to Protect. I was working on my Master's of Divinity at Tyndale at the time, and in the in-ministry MDiv program at Tyndale. And we had to think about engaging the church with the community around some topic. And for me, it was around the topic of safeguarding. And so during my MDiv, I focused on the spiritual impact of abuse. And how can we help communicate to churches that this isn't just about insurance? This is around protecting someone's spiritual development and having them know Jesus Christ and not be harmed by someone abusing them. So when I finished my MDiv, I found that more and more people just viewed me as a policy person, as an expert in abuse prevention, Melodie's a policy person, Melodie's a procedure person. But for me, it's always been about mission. It's always been about God's calling on my life and helping individuals not experience the harm of abuse. Because I had really had my eyes opened up to the impact, the spiritual impact of abuse, I wanted to then research and determine, how do you help people who have been abused, especially if they've been abused within the church? How can we help them with spiritual healing? And so I ended up researching this topic, doing all my reading research on this, my comps on this, and then I interviewed individuals that self-disclosed that they had been abused by someone in the church, sexually abused as a child, by someone in the church, whether that be a pastor, a deacon, a Sunday school teacher, youth pastor. And then they self-disclosed that they had found spiritual healing. So we interviewed them, identified what were some of those common themes that help nurture their spiritual healing. And so my whole thesis is around our findings around what was instrumental in their spiritual healing.
Probably not a fair question to ask, but could you just give us like one example of one key insight? I know it's a huge topic, but any one thing you brought that was key for spiritual healing for people?
For almost every one of the individuals I interviewed, it wasn't sermons. The most instrumental thing is individuals walking alongside of them, being a friend to them, almost going back to that, what does real discipleship look like? and walking alongside of a victim, and just doing life with them, and introducing them to spiritual disciplines. Spiritual disciplines were very instrumental in their healing, whether that be Bible reading, memorization, going on nature walks, prayer, worship, some of those things, practicing solitude, but also entering into lament. And I don't think our churches do a great job of lament. And I think because of the prevalence of abuse within our churches, we should be doing a lot more lament and walking alongside of those that are suffering. I think instead of focusing on, hey, get over it, forgive the person, move on, we have to recognize that there are long-term consequences to abuse. And it's a long journey. I call them victim survivors, because there's times that they feel very much like a victim, but there's other times they are survivors. They become victors in this, but they go back and forth in their journey. And I think having people who become safe people in their life, who are really safe, who aren't trying to do all the advocacy and speak on their behalf and tell the person's story, but just walking alongside and journeying with these individuals. That's what we need more of in our churches, is safe people.
Excellent word there. A couple things I just want to highlight from what you said. One thing about lament, I've long been an advocate that lament should be a part of every liturgical service, in the same way that there's a time for prayer, reflective petitionary prayer, praise, and thanksgiving. There should be a time for lament. And I remember one occasion years ago being in a seminary where I used to teach at a seminary, and there was a healing service that was led by one of the professors, and he invited anybody to come up who wanted physical or spiritual healing of any kind. And I was curious how many people would come up, and 90%, almost the entire room emptied out, and everybody lined up to receive prayer for healing. It was just a reminder of how many people in the course of life in our communities are in the midst of lament and suffering. I heartily commend that point. And also the one that I want to highlight about forgiveness, that so often people who it's not their journey, and yet they're pressuring other people who are victim survivors. You really need to reconcile, you need to forgive. And we have to be very careful that we're not extending the abuse and the harm to those individuals by placing them on our timeline for what restoration looks like.
Excellent.
I'd like to just segue to another question. And this is, so if a work safety person comes out to a work site and they do an audit of this workplace, they might say, okay, that blocked exit, that's a risk. You have to deal with that. Those boxes that are stacked up there, they have to deal with that because they're dangerous. They could fall over. You have to check your fire extinguishers and do all these things, a long checklist to make the workplace safer. What would be some of the advice that you would give to churches in terms of the things you would look for that will be placing that church at greater risk of harm coming to vulnerable people?
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think so many boards today, and I see this, we've seen great improvement in churches around putting policies in place, screening volunteers and training volunteers. We have kept a study going for almost 20 years now of churches and their compliance to the standards that we recommend. And this is a free assessment on our website. And we have seen a significant uptake in the number of churches and organizations that are holding to some of those standards. But what isn't happening is what you're referencing, what we would call a policy audit. And this is when you audit compliance to the policy, similar to how you would do a financial audit. You would do a policy audit and this is a service we offer, where we review their policies, we become familiar with their policies, and then we spend a day or two on site, and we are looking at their registration forms, their screening records, their attendance records, their incident report forms. We're looking at their first aid kits. and their classrooms, and if there's windows and clear sight lines into the classroom. We're looking for compliance to the policies to see if they actually are doing what they have said they should be doing. This should not be the person who's responsible for plan to protect or safeguarding at the church that does this. This shouldn't be the ministry staff members that are implementing the policies. This should be an initiative of the board to see if the policies they've put in place are being adhered to. And so there is some of that cross-referencing. So you would look at your screening records and you'd look at your duty roster and you would compare, are the people that are on your duty roster, have they completed all the steps of screening? When we talk about screening, Randall, we're not just talking about a criminal record check. We're talking about an application, interview, references. Have they been trained? Have they received annual safeguarding training? And then we look at registration forms and we look to see attendance records. And would these attendance records be helpful in a court of law? Can you see the first name and last name of the child and who the adults were in that classroom and the date? Because that's what would be helpful if you've ever found yourself in a court where you were named as someone that could have caused abuse, whether it was vicarious liability or direct liability against abuse.
Some years ago, I was on a ministry council or an elders board of a church. And one of the issues that we addressed eventually, although it was a little awkward, to be honest, was that there was a husband and wife team that were counting the money every week from the offering. So they would get all the money, they would go back to a back room, count it up, and then submit it. And we said best practice, we should have a policy where there's always two people, but they're not related to one another. And great policy, but it's awkward to impose it and introduce it because it views some people who are affected by it as a critique of them or questioning them and their integrity. And I think often this is the challenge that I've experienced when we try to bring about some of these best practices. Do you ever get that kind of pushback from people who say, why don't we trust each other anymore? This creates a climate of suspicion, things like that. And if so, how do you navigate that kind of reaction?
I hear that all the time. That's something I hear almost daily. And I love what one pastor said. Plan to protect is not something we do because we don't trust you. We do this so that our community trusts us. And we also say, and it's so important in your policies, to state the purpose of those policies. It is to protect the vulnerable sector, children, youth, and vulnerable adults, but it's also to protect our staff members and our volunteers against wrongful allegations of abuse. Having a policy like that is protecting that couple from allegations of financial misuse. It holds people accountable and ensures accountability. And we should be transparent in our actions, and we should be willing to be accountable within the church. So that's an excellent policy to have in place, is that two unrelated adults in a classroom. So we are looking in those situations, similar to what you said. We don't want a husband and a wife serving together alone in a classroom or counting the donations, rather that you would have another adult that you would bring in to be like the third adult in that situation that's unrelated.
That is so well stated. I mean, I automatically think of the analogy of a police officer wearing body cam. It's that body cam is there for your protection. When somebody accuses you of police brutality, you've got a record of the whole interaction with them. And if you're still worried about the recording, maybe that's something that is actually a problem with you. That's very well stated. As we're winding down, I'd like to ask you, so there's been this evolution, this development from protecting vulnerable children to youth to vulnerable adults. Is there a sense where virtually any adult within a community could become vulnerable in a particular situation?
Yes, I think that there are times in our life. Um, a vulnerable adult is anyone because of their age or circumstance, whether temporary or permanent, is dependent on someone else. So if you were facing or struggling with a terminal illness, or you lost your sight temporarily, you were in the hospital, you had major surgery, and you were dependent on someone, that would be temporary, where you're temporarily disabled or you're temporarily dependent on someone else. My husband and I were missionaries, and I often felt so vulnerable in Austria because I didn't know German. I had 3 small children under the age of 4. I could not communicate like I could in Canada. People treated me as if I was stupid almost, and that I wasn't an educated person. And I wanted to scream out to say, no, I am an educated person. But I felt very dependent in that circumstance because I didn't have the language. So yes, it could be temporary or permanent.
I think that what's so important
Also,
about that
sorry,
is,
I was
yeah,
just gonna say also
yeah,
that when we go through a crisis or distress in our life,
mhm,
whether we're struggling with grief or a marriage breakdown, or you lose your job, you're experiencing some kind of mental illness or even severe anxiety, you are dependent on individuals. And if you are in a counseling situation and you go for pastoral counseling or care, you are dependent on that therapist or that pastor to help you through that crisis. And that's where we have to be so aware of power differentials and the power differentials that are within a church setting.
really glad you added that because, yeah, I agree so much. And what that says to us is that Plan to Protect, it's not just about some subgroup of the church, right? It's about children, it's about youth, it's about vulnerable adults, it's about every adult who could be vulnerable, which really is all of us. And it's about those who are in power relationships with those vulnerable populations to protect them as well. So it really is an encompassing mission and vision. And I think it's just one so important. So I want to thank you very much, Melodie, for speaking with us today. And I want to thank you for the work that you do, because I think it is just so important for the church today, for its integrity and its witness to the world and the safety of its members. So thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you so much.